Welcome to Ghost Files, where every whisper hides a secret, and every story could be real. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because you never know which story might be waiting for you next. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and get ready, because tonight's story might follow you, even after it ends. The Man Who Watched from the Ridge. Location: Shawnee National Forest, Illinois, 2019. Derek Paulson was 34 years old, a landscaper from St. Louis, Missouri, and camping was the one thing in his life he protected with absolute consistency. No matter what was happening at work, no matter what was going on at home, no matter what the weather was doing every single year, without exception, he took one solo camping trip in late September when the heat had broken and the leaves were turning and the trails in Shawnee National Forest were at their most beautiful. He had been doing it since he was 26. 8 years of solo trips to the same general area of southern Illinois, the Garden of the Gods, the Bell Smith Springs, the trail systems that wound through sandstone formations and hardwood forest and creek valleys that most people in St. Louis had no idea existed 2.5 hours from their front doors. He knew that forest. He knew it the way you know a place when you have walked it alone in every season and in every kind of weather, and at every hour of the day and night. He knew which campsites flooded after rain. He knew which trail junctions had misleading signage. He knew where the deer bedded down in the mornings and where the coyotes moved at dusk. He was not a person who got scared in the woods. He was a person who felt more at home in the woods than almost anywhere else. The trip in September 2019 started normally. He drove down on a Friday afternoon, parked at the Bell Smith Springs trailhead, loaded his pack, and hiked in about 4 miles to a dispersed campsite he had used 3 times before, a flat area beside a clear creek, screened on 3 sides by dense cedar growth, open on one side to a long meadow that ran toward the base of a sandstone ridge. It was one of his favorite spots in the entire forest. He had the whole area to himself, no other cars at the trailhead, no signs of recent campers at the site. He set up his tent, gathered firewood, filtered water from the creek, and had dinner going before dark. The evening was perfect, cool enough for a jacket, still enough to hear the creek clearly. The sky above the meadow full of stars by 8 p.m. He sat by the fire until 10, poured water over the coals, and went to bed. He slept well and woke just before sunrise to the sound of birds starting up in the cedars. He made coffee, ate breakfast, spent the morning exploring the creek upstream from camp. By afternoon, he was back at the site, reading, relaxed, exactly where he wanted to be. It was late afternoon, maybe 4:30, when he first noticed the figure on the ridge. The sandstone ridge ran along the western edge of the meadow, about a 1/4 mile from his campsite. It was not a high ridge, maybe 60 feet above the meadow floor, but it was open at the top, the trees there thin and wind-shaped, and from his camp, he had a clear view of the ridgeline silhouetted against the sky. He had glanced at it dozens of times over the years. He liked the way it looked at sunset. When he glanced at it that afternoon, he saw a person standing at the top. Just a silhouette, a human shape standing at the highest point of the ridge, visible against the sky, facing in the direction of his campsite. He looked at it for a moment without particular alarm. Other people hiked the forest. There was a trail that ran along that ridge. He had walked it himself. A hiker stopping to enjoy the view was completely unremarkable. He looked away and went back to his book. When he looked up again 20 minutes later, the figure was still there. Same position, same place, facing the same direction. He put the book down and looked more carefully. The figure was not moving at all, not shifting weight, not looking around, not doing any of the things a person at a viewpoint naturally does. It was standing with the stillness of something that had been placed there rather than something that had walked there and stopped. Derek sat and watched it for 5 full minutes. It did not move once. He told himself he was overthinking it. He made dinner. He ate. He rebuilt his fire for the evening. He glanced at the ridge several more times as the light faded. The figure was still there each time he looked, becoming harder to see as the sky darkened. And then, as full dark came on, he could no longer make it out against the sky. He felt better once he could no longer see it. He sat by the fire, had a beer, told himself it was a hiker who had enjoyed the view for a while before moving on. Completely reasonable. Completely normal. He went to bed at 10 and fell asleep within minutes. He woke up at 1:20 a.m. He lay still and took stock of what had woken him. The fire was completely out, just cold ash. He had made sure of it before sleeping. The creak was audible. The cedars were moving slightly in a light breeze. He was oriented. Calm, not disoriented the way you sometimes are when you wake in an unfamiliar place. Something specific had pulled him awake. Then he heard it. A sound from the meadow side of his camp. Not footsteps, something more like the sound of someone standing very still in dry grass. The particular compression of dead grass stems under sustained weight. The sound of a person who is not moving. Derek lay in his tent and did not move for a long time. He had a headlamp next to his sleeping bag and a fixed blade knife on the tent pocket next to his head. He always slept with it on solo trips, standard practice for him. He did not reach for either of them yet. He lay still and listened. The sound of compressed grass continued, occasional subtle shifts, not movement, just the micro adjustments a body makes when it is standing in one place for a long time. Whoever was there was standing still, and had been standing still for long enough that the grass beneath them was registering it. Derek's mind ran through the options with the methodical calm that people who spend a lot of time alone outdoors develop. Animal was possible, but no animal stood that still for that long in open grass. Another camper was possible, but no reasonable camper stands silently next to a stranger's tent at 1:20 in the morning. A person in distress was possible lost, injured, disoriented. He could not rule that out. He reached slowly for his headlamp. He put it on his head without turning it on. He unzipped his sleeping bag slowly. He picked up his knife. And then, in one motion, he turned the headlamp on at full brightness and unzipped the tent door and pushed it open. The meadow was empty. The headlamp reached 30 or 40 feet clearly, and the meadow beyond was open and flat and empty under a half moon. He swept the light in both directions along the edge of the camp. Nothing. He stood up fully outside the tent and turned a slow 360, light scanning all the way around. Nothing in any direction. But in the grass directly beside his tent, between the tent and the meadow, there was a flattened area. A rough circle, maybe 2 feet across, where the grass had been pressed down. Derek crouched and put his hand on it. The grass was still warm. He did not sleep again that night. He sat outside his tent with his back against a cedar and his headlamp on and his knife in his hand, and watched the meadow and the tree line and the ridge until the sky began to lighten. At first light, he broke camp in 15 minutes and hiked out at a pace he describes as just below a run. At the trailhead, he sat in his truck for a while before he could bring himself to start the engine. He drove to the nearest town and ate breakfast at a diner, and then drove home to St. Louis and did not stop once. He reported the incident to the Shawnee National Forest Ranger Station by phone the following Monday. The ranger he spoke to asked him several questions: the location of the campsite, the approximate time, whether he had seen anyone on the trail during the day. When Derek mentioned the figure he had seen on the ridge in the afternoon, the ranger was quiet for a moment. Then the ranger asked him if he had noticed anything unusual at the trailhead, when he arrived other vehicles, anything out of the ordinary. Derek thought back. There had been one other vehicle at the trailhead when he arrived Friday afternoon. An older model dark pickup truck. He had not thought anything of it at the time. The ranger said he would note the report and ask Derek to call back if he remembered anything else. Derek drove back down to Shawnee the following spring, but not alone. He went with 2 friends, both experienced campers, both people he trusted. He told them the story on the drive down. They took it seriously without dismissing it. They camped 3 nights and had no incidents. He still camps in Shawnee. He still goes alone sometimes. He tells himself the figure on the ridge was a hiker who lingered too long, and the sound outside his tent was an animal he couldn't identify, and the flat, warm circle in the grass was something he misread in the adrenaline of a 1 a.m. wake-up. He tells himself these things with conviction. He almost believes them. He says the almost is the part that never quite goes away, the small, persistent space between the story he tells himself and the certainty he can no longer quite reach. He says some nights he wakes up and lies in the dark and thinks about that warm circle of pressed grass beside his tent, and he wonders how long the person who made it had been standing there before they heard him wake up. The trail that wasn't on any map. Location: Pisgah National Forest, North Carolina, 2021. Amanda and Claire had been hiking together for 6 years. They met in a trail running group in Asheville, North Carolina, and had graduated from trail running to backpacking to serious multi-day trips through increasingly remote terrain. By the fall of 2021, they were accomplished backcountry hikers, both in their early 30s, both certified in wilderness first aid, both with a deep and practical knowledge of the mountains around Asheville. They did not make careless decisions in the backcountry. They told people where they were going. They carried emergency communication devices. They checked weather and conditions before every trip. They planned the trip for the first weekend of October, 3 nights in a section of Pisgah they had not explored before, in the upper reaches of a watershed south of the main recreational areas where the trails were less traveled and the terrain was more demanding. They studied maps, downloaded GPS tracks, identified 2 potential campsites, and filed a trip plan with a friend who would call search and rescue if they were not back by Sunday evening. They hit the trailhead at 8 a.m. on Friday and were on the trail by 8:15. The day was cold and clear, perfect hiking weather, the leaves at peak color above 4,000 feet. They moved well, made good time, and reached their first campsite, a flat area near a stream crossing about 7 miles in by early afternoon. They set up camp, filtered water, scouted the area, ate an early dinner, and were in their tents by 9 p.m. They broke camp the next morning and continued deeper into the watershed. The trail they were following was shown on their maps, but was clearly lightly maintained. The tread was narrow. Blowdowns had not been cleared, and the blazes on the trees were faded and sometimes hard to find. This was not unusual for seldom-traveled backcountry trails, and they navigated without difficulty using their GPS unit alongside their paper maps. By late morning, they reached a junction they had identified on their maps, their trail meeting another trail that ran along the ridge above them. They stopped to eat and check their location. Amanda pulled out the paper map and confirmed their position. Claire checked the GPS. Both agreed on where they were. That was when Claire noticed the other trail. Not the junction they had planned for another one, a narrow but clearly defined path leading off to the east, away from their intended route, cutting through the undergrowth at an angle that suggested it had been walked regularly and recently. It was not on their paper map. It wasn't on the GPS track they had downloaded. It was not marked with any blaze on the surrounding trees that they could see. They looked at it for a while. In the mountains, informal trails, social trails, hunters' paths, old logging roads reclaimed by vegetation were not unusual. A path not on official maps was not inherently alarming. They noted it and moved on along their intended route. 20 minutes later, the trail they were following joined the ridge and turned north. And the unmarked trail appeared again, emerging from the trees on the right side of their path and running parallel to it for about 100 feet, before diverging back into the forest to the east. The same narrow beaten track, the same recent-looking tread, now clearly following them along the ridge before turning away. Amanda stopped and looked at it for a long time. Claire stood beside her. Neither of them said what both of them were thinking, that two appearances of an unmapped trail in 20 minutes, first at a junction below and now paralleling them on the ridge, did not feel like a coincidence. They continued. They were moving toward their second campsite another 2 miles along the ridge, and they were not the kind of hikers who turned around at an unsettling feeling. They were careful, methodical people. They kept moving. An hour later, they reached the area where their second campsite was supposed to be a flat clearing at the edge of a small stream noted on their map. The clearing was there. The stream was there. And the unmarked trail was there, emerging from the forest on the east side of the clearing and crossing it before disappearing back into the trees on the other side. Whoever used that trail used this clearing too. They set up camp anyway. It was late afternoon. They were 7 miles from the nearest trailhead in either direction, and the light was fading. They ate dinner. They did not build a fire that night by unspoken agreement. They kept the camp dark and quiet. They were in their tents by 8 p.m. Amanda heard it first. Footsteps on the unmarked trail coming from the east, crossing the clearing, passing within 20 feet of their tents. A single person walking at an unhurried pace, not trying to be quiet, but not making unnecessary noise either. The sound of someone walking a familiar route in the dark. She reached through the tent wall and tapped Claire's tent. One tap, the signal they had established years ago that meant, be still and listen. She heard Claire go completely quiet. The footsteps crossed the clearing and continued into the forest on the west side. They faded. Silence returned. The two women lay in their separate tents and did not move for a very long time. After 15 minutes, Amanda quietly activated her satellite communicator and sent a check-in message to their emergency contact. Not an SOS, just a message saying their location and that they had observed an unknown individual near their campsite and were monitoring the situation. Their contact replied within 3 minutes, acknowledged, standing by, call if needed. The footsteps came back at 2 a.m., east to west again. Same pace, same route. Crossing the clearing, passing the tents, continuing into the western forest. Gone. They broke camp at first light 6:30 a.m. and moved fast. They made the trailhead in 4 hours, a pace that left them both winded and silent. Back at their car, they sat for a moment before either of them spoke. Claire pulled out her phone and searched for any information about the area trail reports, forum posts, anything. She found a post on a hiking forum from 3 years earlier, written by a solo hiker who had camped in the same general area. He described hearing someone moving on an unmapped trail near his campsite at night. He had mentioned it to a local outfitter in Asheville and been told that there were people who had been living off-grid in the deep hollows of Pisgah for decades. Not the romantic kind of off-grid living, the other kind people who did not want to be found and who moved through the backcountry at night along routes they had built and maintained over many years. The outfitter had apparently told the forum poster, "If you hear someone on a trail that isn't on any map, leave the area as soon as it's light enough to travel safely." Amanda and Claire sat in the parking lot and read that post twice. Then they drove back to Asheville and did not speak much on the way. When they got back to the city, they went to a diner and sat across from each other and ate breakfast and eventually started talking about what had happened in the way that two experienced and rational people talk about something they cannot fully explain. Amanda is still hiking. She and Claire went back to Pisgah the following spring on a completely different trail. They have never returned to that watershed. The GPS track from that trip is still on Amanda's device. She has looked at it several times over the years, tracing the route they walked, trying to identify exactly where the unmarked trail first appeared and where it crossed their camp. She says the thing she cannot stop thinking about is the pace, not rushing, not sneaking, just walking the easy, unhurried pace of someone traveling a route they know completely in the dark. The pace of a person who has walked that path so many times that they no longer need to think about where their feet are going. She says that kind of familiarity with a route takes years, and every time she thinks about it, she thinks about how many other hikers must have camped in that clearing and lain awake and heard those same footsteps in the dark. What came to the fire? Location: Sam Houston, National Forest, Texas, 2022. This story was told by a man named Curtis Baines, 41, a former Marine and current high school football coach from Conroe, Texas. Curtis is not a man who chooses his words carelessly, and he is not a man who is easily disturbed. He ran 2 combat deployments in his 20s and coached high school football for 15 years. He had learned to project calm because the people around him needed him calm. He tells this story the way a person tells a story they have been over many times in their own head and have decided simply to say plainly without embellishment, because the plain version is disturbing enough. Curtis went camping in Sam Houston National Forest the weekend of Labor Day 2022. He went alone. His 2 boys were with his ex-wife for the holiday weekend, and he had 3 days with nothing to do, and a truck full of gear, and a long-standing intention to try a dispersed campsite in Sam Houston he had been told about by a colleague who hunted that area. The site was down a 2-track dirt road, about 3 miles from the nearest paved road, at the edge of a large pine plantation that bordered a stretch of natural bottomland forest. Remote by Texas standards, no facilities, no other campers, no signal for several miles in most directions. He arrived on Saturday afternoon. The site was exactly as described: a cleared area among tall pines, a ring of stones for a fire, a flat spot for a tent, and beyond the tree line, the thick bottomland hardwood forest with a small creek running through it. He set up his tent, gathered wood, and had a fire going by the time the light faded. He cooked a simple dinner over the fire, steak and potatoes, the kind of meal that tastes better outdoors for reasons that have nothing to do with the food itself, and sat with a whiskey and watched the fire die down and felt, as he put it, like himself, in a way he did not always feel during the school year. He went to bed at 11 p.m. and slept deeply and dreamlessly until 3:15 in the morning. He woke up the way he had always woken up when something was wrong, not gradually, not confused, but all at once, fully alert, taking in information before he had consciously decided to. It was something he attributed to his military training, the ability to go from sleep to full situational awareness in seconds. What he was aware of was this: his fire, which he had completely extinguished before sleeping, was not extinguished. It was burning. Not large, a modest, steady fire, the kind that suggests someone has recently added wood and settled it in, orange and stable, and throwing heat that he could feel through the tent wall from 15 feet away. He lay still for a moment and processed this. He was certain he had put the fire out. He was methodical about fire safety in dry Texas summers. He had poured water over the coals and stirred them himself before getting in his tent. The fire that was currently burning was not a restarted ember. It was a built fire. Someone had built a fire at his campsite while he slept. He reached for his 9mm, which he slept with on overnight solo trips the way some people sleep with a glass of water on the nightstand. Just there, just in case. He held it in his right hand. He lay still and listened. There was someone sitting by the fire. He could hear them, the particular sounds of a person sitting still by a fire. The slight shift of weight, the occasional intake of breath, the sound of a stick being moved in the coals. A person sitting comfortably at a fire that wasn't theirs, at someone else's campsite, at 3:15 in the morning, as if they had every right to be there. Curtis unzipped his tent and stepped out. A man was sitting on the log across the fire from him. Older Curtis estimated late 60s or early 70s. Thin, deeply weathered, wearing a canvas jacket that looked like it had been in the field for years. He was holding a stick and looking into the fire. When Curtis stepped out, the man looked up. He did not appear startled. He did not move. He looked at Curtis with the fire between them and said nothing. Curtis kept the gun at his side and said, "Who are you?" The man looked at him for a moment longer and then looked back at the fire. Curtis said it again, louder. "Who are you? What are you doing here?" The man stirred the coals with his stick. He said something Curtis describes it as a single word, spoken quietly, that he could not make out over the sound of the fire. Curtis moved around the fire toward the man. He said clearly, "I am asking you to tell me who you are and what you are doing at my campsite." The man looked up at him from the log. Close now, Curtis could see his face fully in the firelight. He describes the man's expression as calm, in a way that was itself unsettling. Not the calm of someone who was unaware of the tension of the situation, but the calm of someone who was fully aware of it and did not care. As if Curtis's presence, his voice, his weapon were all registered and entirely irrelevant. The man stood up. He was taller than Curtis had estimated, well over 6 feet, thin but with the wiry, enduring kind of physicality that old men who have spent their lives outdoors sometimes have. He looked at Curtis for a moment. Then he turned and walked into the forest, not hurrying, not running, walking at a steady, deliberate pace into the bottomland forest, away from the fire, into the dark. Curtis watched the tree line for a long time. He heard the man's footsteps for about 30 seconds, and then nothing. He circled the campsite with his flashlight. He checked his truck locked, untouched. He checked his gear, nothing disturbed, nothing taken. He went back to the fire and crouched beside it. The man had added at least 4 or 5 pieces of wood. The fire would burn for another 2 hours. Curtis did not sleep again. He sat in his camp chair with his back to the truck and his flashlight on, and his weapon in his lap, and watched the forest until it was light enough to see clearly. Then he packed his camp in under 20 minutes and drove out. He drove to the first gas station with signal and called the county sheriff's office non-emergency line. He described the incident and gave his location. The dispatcher told him she would pass it on. He asked if there had been any reports of issues in that area of Sam Houston. She said she was not able to share that information. 2 weeks later, a colleague who hunted the same area mentioned to Curtis that he had heard there were homeless camps in the deeper parts of that forest, people who had been living rough in the bottomland for years, occasionally appearing at hunting camps at night to look for food or supplies. He said most of them were harmless. He said most. Curtis has told this story to several people. He says the reactions divide pretty cleanly between people who focus on the practical explanation, a rough sleeper, a lost person, someone looking for food, and people who focus on what Curtis himself focuses on, which is the fire, not the man, not the calm, not the walk into the darkness, the fire, because the man had not been looking for food. He had not taken anything. He had not asked for anything. He had come to a sleeping campsite in the middle of the night and built a fire and sat beside it as if it were his own and waited. Curtis asks the same question every time he gets to this part of the story. He looks at whoever he is telling it to, and he asks, "What do you build a fire for in the middle of the night at a stranger's campsite while they are sleeping?" He says he has never gotten an answer that fully satisfied him. He says he has thought about it for 2 years, and he has only been able to come up with 2 possibilities. Either the man was building the fire for warmth and company, in which case, why sit silently at a stranger's camp in the dark instead of making yourself known like a person with nothing to hide? Or the man was building the fire for light. And if it was for light, then the question becomes what he was using the light to look at. And the answer to that question is the thing that still keeps Curtis Baines, a former Marine, who has been in situations that would make most people's hands shake awake on certain nights in October, when the air gets cool and the dark comes early, and the idea of a fire in the woods seems less like comfort and more like something else entirely. Stay safe out there. Tell someone where you are going. And if something feels wrong at 3 a.m., trust that feeling completely